On the morning of March 3rd, 2022, workers at the Blohm plus Voss shipyard in Hamburg arrived to find their workplace transformed into something resembling a crime scene. The massive steel gates were locked. Security guards turned away the craftsmen who had been putting the finishing touches on a 512-foot super yacht for the past 5 months. Inside that yacht, 84 crew members were receiving termination notices via email. None of them would be paid for the month. None of them would ever set foot on the vessel again. The yacht they'd been maintaining, a behemoth named Dilbar, had just become the most expensive piece of trapped property in maritime history. Worth somewhere between $600 million and $800 million, this floating palace couldn't move an inch. German authorities had placed it under export control sanctions, and its owner, a Russian billionaire named Alisher Usmanov, was about to lose everything he'd spent decades building. The Dilbar wasn't just any super yacht. At 15,917 gross tons, she held the title of the world's largest motor yacht by interior volume. Longer yachts existed, sure. The Azam stretched to 604 feet. But Dilbar had something no other yacht could claim: 3,800 square meters of living space spread across multiple decks, each one more opulent than most people's entire houses. Her name came from a Persian word meaning beloved, chosen by Usmanov to honor his mother. This was actually his second yacht with that name. The first Dilbar, a mere 110 meters, had been renamed and sold off in 2018 when this newer, grander version was ready. That earlier yacht had cost $250 million. This one cost more than triple that amount, and the monthly operating costs alone ran between $4 and $7 million. Just filling her fuel tanks cost $783,000. To put that in perspective, you could buy a one-bedroom apartment in Manhattan or 8 brand new Tesla Model S sedans for the price of a single refueling. The story of how Dilbar ended up trapped in Germany begins long before the yacht was ever conceived. In the collapsing Soviet Union of the 1980s, Alisher Burkhanovich Usmanov was born September 9, 1953, in Chust, a small city in Uzbekistan. His father worked as a state prosecutor in Tashkent, the capital, and young Alisher grew up in a world of Soviet bureaucracy and Communist Party privilege. He attended the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, a prestigious university known for producing diplomats and KGB officers. He graduated in 1976 with a degree in international law and returned to Tashkent to work as director of the Foreign Economic Association of the Soviet Peace Committee, which many believed was a front organization for Soviet intelligence services. By all accounts, Usmanov was on track for a comfortable career in the Soviet system. Then, in August of 1980, everything fell apart. Usmanov was arrested and convicted on charges that would haunt him for the rest of his life: fraud, corruption, theft of state property, extortion, and taking bribes under aggravating circumstances. The specific allegations included shaking down an army officer and participating in embezzlement schemes with other members of the Uzbek elite. He was 26 years old. The military tribunal of the Turkestan Military District sentenced him to 8 years in a remote Uzbek prison. According to later reports, he was sent to a facility where many men his prosecutor father had put behind bars were serving time. Apparently an intentional decision by authorities who wanted him to suffer or perhaps never emerge alive. Usmanov would spend the next 6 years in that prison before being released in 1986 for good behavior and for expressing remorse. The experience shaped everything that came after. Years later, in July of 2000, the Supreme Court of Uzbekistan would vacate his conviction entirely, ruling that the original case was unjust, no crime was ever committed, and the evidence had been fabricated. Usmanov maintains to this day that he was a political prisoner, caught up in power struggles among the Uzbek elite during a turbulent period of Soviet history. Critics, including Craig Murray, the former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, have questioned this narrative, suggesting the conviction was legitimate and the later exoneration came through political connections. Whether innocent or guilty, Usmanov emerged from prison with something most ex-convicts do not possess: an iron will and connections that would prove invaluable. In the late 1980s, as the Soviet Union began its final death spiral, Usmanov started a business that seemed almost comically mundane but would make him a millionaire before the USSR officially dissolved. He went into plastic bag manufacturing. In a country where basic consumer goods were chronically scarce, plastic bags were like gold. Usmanov discovered that with 1 ton of polymer costing 437 rubles, he could produce over 30,000 plastic bags that sold for roughly 1 ruble each. The math was simple and the profits were enormous. By the time Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms had opened the economy enough for private enterprise, Usmanov had stockpiled a fortune that positioned him perfectly for what came next. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 created opportunities for wealth accumulation on a scale the world had rarely seen. State assets that had belonged to 300 million people were suddenly up for grabs, often sold for pennies on the dollar to those with the right connections. Usmanov had those connections. In the early 1990s, he began investing aggressively in metal and mining operations. In 1997, he graduated from the Finance Academy under the government of the Russian Federation with a specialization in banking. And that same year, he became head of Gazprom Invest Holding, a subsidiary of the state gas giant Gazprom. His job was to reclaim Gazprom's assets that had been transferred into private hands during the chaotic privatization years. He succeeded spectacularly, restoring much of the company's lost value and reestablishing Gazprom as the dominant state monopoly it remains today. This work brought him into the orbit of Russia as new power structure and a rising politician named Vladimir Putin. In 2004, Usmanov made the acquisition that would define his fortune. He acquired Metalloinvest, consolidating stakes in some of Russia's most valuable iron ore and steel operations, including Mikhailovsky Gok and Ural Steel. With a 49% stake in what became one of the world's leading iron ore holdings, Usmanov's net worth exploded. By 2007, he'd expanded into media, purchasing the Kommersant Publishing House, one of Russia's most respected journalistic institutions. But Usmanov had bigger ambitions than just Russian industrial assets. In 2008, he began making the technology investments that would multiply his wealth yet again. Through investment vehicles like DST Global and Mail, Rue Group, he poured hundreds of millions into internet companies that most traditional Russian oligarchs dismissed as Silicon Valley pipe dreams. The Facebook investment would become legendary. In 2009, amid the global financial crisis, when other investors were demanding harsh terms and protective clauses, Usmanov and his Russian business partners approached Mark Zuckerberg with a proposition. They would invest $200 million in Facebook for almost 10% of the company, and they would give up voting rights on those shares, allowing Zuckerberg to maintain control. Other investors at the time were terrified of the economic collapse and wanted power over company decisions. Usmanov had a different philosophy. He'd learned during the Russian ruble crisis of 1998 that you make the most money by investing boldly just before a recovery. He called it his theory of crisis. Employ the crisis to create additional margin. You need to understand when the moment of growth is coming and invest just before that. When Facebook went public in May of 2012, Usmanov's stake was worth over $1 billion. He'd quintupled his money in less than 3 years. He made similar investments in Alibaba, Twitter, Xiaomi, and Airbnb. By 2012, Forbes ranked him as the richest person in Russia, with wealth estimated at $18.1 billion. With that kind of money, Usmanov could afford almost anything, and what he wanted was the most magnificent yacht ever built. He'd owned the first Dilbar since 2008, a respectable 110-meter vessel that cost $250 million. But by the early 2010s, as his wealth continued to grow and as other Russian oligarchs commissioned ever larger yachts, Usmanov decided he wanted something that would make a statement. Not just a big yacht, but the biggest yacht by the metric that mattered most to him: interior volume. He wanted space, grandeur, the ability to host events and entertain guests on a scale that would dwarf every other private vessel on Earth. In approximately 2012, he approached Lürssen, the legendary German shipyard in Bremen that had been building luxury vessels since 1875. The project was given the code name Project Omar, and the specifications were staggering. The yacht would be 156 meters, just over 512 feet. She would displace 15,917 gross tons, more than some commercial cruise ships. The exterior would be designed by Espen Oino, a renowned Monaco-based naval architect, whose firm had worked on some of the world's most expensive yachts. The interior would be the work of Andrew Winch Design from Britain, known for creating spaces that combined contemporary luxury with timeless elegance. The color scheme would feature a light ivory hull with bronze accents, giving Dilbar a classic profile despite her massive proportions. The construction would take more than 4 years and would push the boundaries of what was technically possible in private yacht building. Lürssen later claimed that Dilbar was one of the most complex and challenging yachts ever built in terms of both dimensions and technology. The engineering challenges were immense. To power a vessel this size, Lürssen installed 6 separate power plants, generating a combined 40,000 horsepower through a 30,000 kilowatt diesel-electric hybrid system. This was the most powerful propulsion system ever fitted to a superyacht, and Lürssen claimed it made Dilbar capable of speeds up to 26 knots despite weighing as much as a small warship. The electrical systems alone required 1,100 kilometers of cabling to be threaded through the hull and superstructure, enough wire to stretch from Hamburg to Rome. The yacht would have 2 helipads, one at the bow and another on the aft top deck, capable of accommodating Usmanov's Airbus H-175 helicopter. She could carry up to 96 crew members in 40 separate cabins, along with 24 guests in 12 luxurious staterooms. But the features that really set Dilbar apart were the almost absurd displays of luxury that Usmanov insisted upon. The swimming pool was 25 meters long and held 180 cubic meters of water, making it the largest pool ever installed on a yacht. To put that in context, an Olympic swimming pool is 50 meters long. Dilbar's pool was half that size, installed indoors on a private vessel. The pool area was climate-controlled, surrounded by lounging spaces with over 1,000 custom-designed sofa cushions, each one individually crafted to fit specific locations throughout the yacht. Perhaps most bizarrely, Usmanov insisted on having a real garden aboard Dilbar, with actual grass that could survive in salt air and the constant motion of the sea. He hired Axel Massmann, German architect and founder of Yacht Green, to develop a special variety of grass and source plants from Mediterranean climates. The plants had to be from within EU waters to avoid customs complications when the yacht moved between European ports. The garden became one of Dilbar's signature features, a patch of green amid all that steel and ocean. The yacht was launched on November 14, 2015, and after months of final fitting and sea trials, she was delivered to Usmanov in May of 2016. The price tag was never officially disclosed, but industry experts estimated the cost at somewhere between $600 million and $800 million, possibly as high as $1 billion, based on calculations of $65,000 per gross ton. Whatever the exact figure, Dilbar immediately became one of the 3 most expensive yachts ever built, competing only with vessels like Roman Abramovich's Eclipse and the Sheikh of Abu Dhabi's Azam. She also became one of the most expensive assets to maintain, with a crew of 80 to 96 people requiring salaries, benefits, and training, with fuel costs in the hundreds of thousands per fill-up, with docking fees at exclusive marinas, insurance premiums, and constant maintenance. The yacht generated annual operating costs between $50 million and $80 million. One leaked estimate suggested the monthly electricity bill alone was $47,000. Usmanov used Dilbar the way billionaires use such vessels, as a floating home base during summers in the Mediterranean, as a status symbol at international events, and as a private sanctuary away from the cameras and the questions that followed him everywhere in Russia. The yacht spent time in Monaco, the south of France, Sardinia, and Cyprus. She was photographed off the coast of Weymouth in England in June of 2020. She became a fixture at places like the Quai des Milliardaires in Antibes, France, where the world's largest yachts lined up like a parade of excess. By all accounts, Usmanov took pride in Dilbar's specifications and loved explaining to visitors how she held records for interior volume and pool size. He named her after his mother, which suggested genuine sentiment behind all the steel and luxury. But he also named her with an awareness that in the rarefied world of superyacht owners, where billionaires compete through their vessels, Dilbar made a statement about his arrival at the pinnacle of global wealth. Then came 2021, and with it, the decision that would trap Dilbar in Germany. In October of that year, Usmanov arranged for the yacht to undergo a scheduled refit at the Blohm-Plustfoss shipyard in Hamburg. Refit work is common for superyachts, involving everything from mechanical maintenance to interior updates and cosmetic improvements. Hamburg was a logical choice, as Lurson's facilities were nearby and Blohm-Plustfoss was one of Europe's premier shipyards for large vessel work. Dilbar entered the shipyard in October, was placed in dry dock, and work began on what was expected to be several months of routine maintenance. The yacht was completely stationary, propped up on supports, surrounded by scaffolding and tarps. Crews of specialized workers descended on the vessel to inspect engines, repaint sections of the hull, update interior furnishings, and perform the 1,000 small tasks that keep a yacht like Dilbar in perfect condition. By early 2022, the work was still ongoing. Nobody involved with the refit had any idea that within weeks, Dilbar would become the most famous trapped yacht in the world. On February 24, 2022, Russian forces invaded Ukraine. The world had known for weeks that an attack was likely, as Russian troops massed along the border in diplomatic efforts to prevent war collapsed. But the actual assault still shocked many observers with its scale and brutality. Within hours, Western governments began implementing punishing sanctions against Russia, targeting not just the government, but also the oligarchs, seen as supporting Vladimir Putin's regime. The European Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom all maintained lists of wealthy Russians, who had grown rich through connections to Putin, and who were believed to enable his hold on power. These sanctions included asset freezes and travel bans designed to hit the oligarchs where it hurt most: their wealth and their ability to enjoy the lavish lifestyles they'd built over decades. On February 28th, just 4 days after the invasion began, Alisher Usmanov found himself on the European Union's sanctions list. The official journal of the European Union named him as a pro-Kremlin oligarch, with particularly close ties to Russian President Vladimir Putin, and identified him as one of Vladimir Putin's favorite oligarchs. The sanctions meant that all of Usmanov's assets within EU jurisdiction were immediately frozen. He couldn't move money, sell properties, or access bank accounts. More critically for the story of Dilbar, any property he owned in the EU was now trapped. On March 1st, President Joe Biden gave his State of the Union address and specifically mentioned the campaign to seize Russian oligarch assets. "We are joining with our European allies to find and seize your yachts, your luxury apartments, your private jets," Biden declared. It was a direct threat aimed at people like Usmanov, and it signaled that governments were willing to go after the most visible symbols of oligarch wealth. Usmanov released a statement the next day. On 28 February 2022, "I became the target of restrictive measures imposed by the European Union. I believe that such a decision is unfair, and the reasons employed to justify the sanctions are a set of false and defamatory allegations, damaging my honor, dignity, and business reputation. But the sanctions didn't care about fairness or defamation. They were in effect, and Dilbar, sitting motionless in a Hamburg shipyard, was suddenly in the crosshairs." On March 2nd, Forbes magazine reported that the German government had seized Dilbar. The story spread instantly through international media. Workers at Blohm plus Voss arrived that morning to find they couldn't access the yacht. Security had been increased. The German government had stepped in overnight. The reality was slightly more complicated than a seizure, though the practical effect was the same. German authorities clarified within days that Dilbar hadn't been formally seized, but rather was subject to export control sanctions. The distinction was technical but important. A seizure implies the government taking ownership. Export control sanctions mean the asset can't leave the jurisdiction without special permission from authorities. Dilbar couldn't sail out of Hamburg. She couldn't even be towed to another German port. She was stuck, and unless the sanctions were lifted or a court ruled otherwise, she would remain stuck indefinitely. The entire crew, 84 people who'd been living and working aboard the yacht, received termination notices on March 6th. None of them would be paid going forward. The yacht's operations ceased entirely. Dilbar, which had required constant attention from dozens of specialists, sat idle in her dry dock. But the story got more complicated when German federal police began investigating exactly who owned Dilbar. The yacht's registration raised immediate questions. She was owned by Navis Marine Limited, a company registered in the Cayman Islands, which was itself owned by Almanor Holdings Limited in Cyprus, which was controlled by Pomerol Capital SA in Switzerland, which held shares in trust for something called the Sisters Trust. Usmanov's representatives claimed he hadn't been a shareholder of the trust company since 2017 and therefore didn't technically own the yacht. This kind of ownership structure is common among the ultra-wealthy, designed to minimize taxes and provide legal distance between billionaires and their assets. It's also designed to make seizures difficult because proving ownership becomes a legal nightmare involving multiple jurisdictions and layers of corporate paperwork. The German Federal Criminal Police Office, known by its German acronym BKA, spent weeks untangling the ownership structure. Through extensive investigations despite offshore concealment, as the German embassy in Washington later tweeted, the BKA determined that Dilbar actually belonged to Usmanov's sister, Gulbahor Ismailova. She was the beneficiary of the Sisters Trust. This revelation changed everything, because while Usmanov had been sanctioned immediately after the invasion, Ismailova had not. For a few weeks, her ownership of the yacht provided a potential loophole, but Western governments moved quickly to close that gap. On April 13, 2022, the United Kingdom sanctioned Ismailova. The European Union followed the next day. Both entities made clear that they believed Usmanov had indirectly transferred assets to his sister, including leaving her as Dilbar's only beneficial owner, specifically to evade sanctions. The EU's official explanation laid out the corporate structure. The owner of the yacht, Dilbar, is Navis Marine Limited, Cayman Islands, whose shareholder is Almanor Holdings Limited, Cyprus, and all shares in that holding company are held by Pomerol Capital SA, Switzerland, in trust for the benefit of the Sisters Trust. But now Ismailova was sanctioned too, which meant the yacht was definitively trapped. On April 14th, Germany officially impounded Dilbar. This wasn't just export control anymore. This was a full seizure based on the determination that the yacht belonged to a sanctioned individual. The yacht had been valued by the U.S. Treasury Department at between $600 million and $735 million. By June of 2022, some estimates put her value as high as $750 million. She was sitting in Hamburg, completely immobilized, racking up no income, requiring constant maintenance to prevent deterioration, and costing German authorities money and resources to keep under guard. Nobody was paying the crew. Nobody was paying for upkeep. The yacht was trapped in a legal and financial limbo that could last for years. Usmanov fought back through the courts. He filed an appeal at the EU's General Court on April 29th, asking the bloc's second highest tribunal to suspend the sanctions until judges could decide on the merits of his case. His lawyers argued that the sanctions were causing him irreparable harm, damaging his business interests and reputation without proper due process. They emphasized that he wasn't the legal owner of Dilbar, that the yacht belonged to a trust structure he didn't control, and that his sister had been sanctioned based on assumptions rather than evidence. The court rejected the appeal in July of 2022. The judges ruled that Usmanov had failed to demonstrate a direct causal link between his inclusion on the EU sanctions list and the financial situation of his various business subsidiaries. They also found that he hadn't proven serious irreparable harm that would justify suspending the sanctions while litigation continued. For Usmanov, it was a devastating loss. The yacht he'd spent years planning and hundreds of millions building was going to remain in Germany for the foreseeable future. The legal battles continued to multiply. In 2023, German authorities conducted searches aboard Dilbar as part of investigations into alleged tax evasion, money laundering, and violations of foreign trade law. The BKA had come across 36 offshore companies and 90 suspicious money laundering reports connected to Usmanov during their investigations. They obtained search warrants and raided the yacht, seizing documents and materials they believed were relevant to their criminal investigation. Usmanov's legal team immediately challenged these searches, arguing that they breached his right to the inviolability of the home and infringed on his human dignity. In May of 2023, they won a significant victory when the Frankfurt Regional Court invalidated the search warrants that had authorized the raids. The court ruled there were procedural irregularities and that investigators had relied on unsubstantiated assumptions. The ruling prohibited authorities from retaining any items seized during the invalid searches. It was a technical legal win for Usmanov, though it didn't change the fundamental reality that Dilbar remained trapped in Hamburg. The distinction the court made was important. The searches were invalid. But that was separate from the yacht's ongoing administrative seizure under EU sanctions. Just because the criminal investigation had procedural problems didn't mean the sanctions were lifted. Dilbar stayed exactly where she was, covered in tarps in a Hamburg dry dock, slowly accumulating months and then years of immobility. By November of 2024, German prosecutors in Frankfurt dropped their money laundering investigation against Usmanov entirely. The billionaire agreed to pay a voluntary fine of 4 million euros, split between charities and the state, but this was explicitly not an admission of guilt. His lawyer said that after more than 2.5 years, the investigation had failed to prove the accusations against him. Another legal victory, at least on paper, but still Dilbar didn't move. Then came one of the strangest turns in the entire saga. In May of 2025, the Hamburg Regional Court issued a ruling that shocked journalists and legal observers. The court ruled that a Luxembourg-based news outlet, the Luxembourg Times, had published false information when it stated that Alisher Usmanov owned the yacht Dilbar. The court found that this claim violated Usmanov's rights and prohibited media outlets from making similar statements. The penalties for violating the ruling were severe, up to 250,000 euros in fines or up to 6 months in jail. The Luxembourg Times removed the contested section from its article. What made this ruling so controversial was that it effectively created a situation where journalists could not report what seemed to be obvious: that Usmanov, regardless of technical ownership structures, was the person who commissioned Dilbar, paid for her construction, and used her as his personal yacht for years. The court's position was that because the yacht was held in a trust with his sister as beneficiary, and Usmanov had not been a shareholder since 2017, saying he owned it was factually incorrect and defamatory. Critics saw this as an attempt to use Germany's strict defamation laws to rewrite the narrative around Dilbar. Even if the technical legal ownership was in his sister's name, everyone understood that Usmanov was the ultimate beneficial owner, the person who controlled the asset even if his name didn't appear on registration documents. The ruling created a chilling effect where media outlets had to be extraordinarily careful about how they described the yacht's ownership, even as it sat trapped in Hamburg as a direct result of sanctions against Usmanov and his sister. The whole situation highlighted how complex and murky ownership structures in the world of superyachts and offshore trusts can become, and how billionaires can use legal technicalities to obscure their control of assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. During all these legal battles, Dilbar sat motionless, a symbol of wealth frozen in place by geopolitics. Other Russian oligarchs had fared differently. Some had seen the invasion coming and moved their yachts out of European waters before sanctions hit. Putin's own yacht, Graceful, had fled Hamburg just weeks before the invasion, making it to Kaliningrad, Russia, before authorities could act. Roman Abramovich's yachts, the Solaris and others, had escaped to Turkey and the UAE, countries that weren't participating in Western sanctions. Some oligarchs had sent their vessels to the Maldives or the Seychelles, remote locations with no extradition treaties and friendly attitudes toward Russian money. But Usmanov, perhaps too confident in his offshore ownership structures, had left Dilbar in Germany for what was supposed to be routine maintenance. Now she was the highest profile trapped superyacht in the world. The yacht's presence in Hamburg created its own problems. Superyachts require constant maintenance even when not in use. Engines need to be run periodically. Electrical systems need to be checked. Hulls need to be inspected for corrosion. Interior furnishings need to be protected from humidity and temperature fluctuations. Without a crew, and without anyone paying for maintenance, Dilbar was at risk of deteriorating. The German government found itself in the awkward position of being responsible for a yacht worth $750 million that was generating no income and required resources just to keep from falling apart. Some officials suggested selling the yacht, as Antigua and Barbuda had done with another sanctioned Russian yacht, the Alfa Nero, which sold for $40 million in July of 2024, $80 million less than its presumed original value. But selling Dilbar would create a legal nightmare of its own, given the ongoing court battles over ownership and sanctions. For a while in 2022, the yacht's location tracking on marine traffic websites showed Dilbar in Sardinia, far from Hamburg. This caused brief excitement and confusion, until it became clear that someone had hacked the AIS automatic identification system that ships use to broadcast their locations. The yacht was still very much in Hamburg, visible on live webcam feeds from hotels overlooking the port. The hacked location data was likely someone's idea of a prank or possibly an attempt by pro-Russian hackers to spread disinformation. Either way, Dilbar wasn't going anywhere. By late 2024, the yacht had been immobilized for nearly 3 years. She'd gone from being the crown jewel of Usmanov's assets, the ultimate expression of his wealth and success, to being a very expensive piece of trapped steel sitting in a German shipyard while lawyers argued over paperwork. Then came October of 2025, and everything changed again. Video footage emerged showing Dilbar in the North Sea, apparently conducting sea trials. The yacht was underway, moving under her own power, no longer trapped in Hamburg. Marine tracking data confirmed she was flying the Cayman Islands flag and appeared to be heading toward the Mediterranean. The sightings suggested she'd somehow been released from the sanctions that had held her for 3.5 years. The German government hadn't announced any change in status. The EU sanctions lists still included both Usmanov and his sister. So how was Dilbar moving? The answer wasn't entirely clear. Representatives for Usmanov maintained that he held no control over the yacht, that it belonged to an independent trustee of an irrevocable family trust, and that neither Usmanov nor his family members were beneficiaries anymore. The ownership was registered to Gulbahor Ismailova, but she'd been excluded from the trust after sanctions were imposed on her. In theory, this meant the yacht belonged to a trust with no beneficiaries, controlled by a trustee who was supposedly independent of Usmanov and his family. If that legal structure was now being accepted by German courts and EU authorities, it would mean Dilbar was no longer considered a sanctioned asset. The yacht could leave German waters. The trustee could operate it, or sell it, or move it to a jurisdiction beyond the reach of Western sanctions. For Usmanov, it would represent a stunning legal victory, the culmination of years of expensive litigation and carefully structured offshore entities. But it would also represent a failure of the sanctions regime, a demonstration that, with enough lawyers and enough complexity in ownership structures, billionaires can shield assets even from coordinated international efforts to freeze their wealth. The full story of how Dilbar escaped, if she indeed did escape, was still unfolding as reports came in of her movements. What was clear was that the yacht, which had become the most visible symbol of trapped Russian oligarch wealth, was no longer sitting idle in Hamburg. The saga of Dilbar raises uncomfortable questions about wealth, power, and accountability in the 21st century. Alisher Usmanov is not accused of being a drug trafficker or a murderer. His inclusion on sanctions lists stems from his perceived closeness to Vladimir Putin and his status as someone who has benefited from and supported Putin's regime. The criminal conviction he received in 1980, even though it was later vacated, remains a source of controversy and suggests a complicated past. But his primary sin, in the eyes of Western governments, is being part of Putin's inner circle during a war that has killed hundreds of thousands of people and displaced millions more. The sanctions are designed to pressure Putin by targeting the wealth of oligarchs who keep him in power. Whether this strategy works is an open question. Usmanov still has billions of dollars in assets, even if some of them are frozen or seized. He still controls major companies and has business interests around the world. Losing access to his yacht for 3 years was undoubtedly painful and embarrassing, but it didn't make him poor. It didn't force him to renounce Putin or speak out against the war. What it did do was demonstrate the reach of Western sanctions and show that billionaires aren't entirely beyond the reach of government action. The yacht itself is a testament to inequality on a scale that most people can barely comprehend. The $600 million to $800 million Usmanov spent building Dilbar could have funded hospitals, schools, or infrastructure projects that would benefit hundreds of thousands of people. The $50 to $80 million in annual operating costs alone would be life-changing for entire communities. But in the world Usmanov inhabits, spending these sums on a private yacht is not unusual. It's expected. Roman Abramovich has yachts that rival Dilbar in size and cost. Sheikh Khalifa of Abu Dhabi has the Azam, which at 604 feet is even longer, though not as voluminous. The Sultan of Oman has the Fulk Al Salma. These vessels exist as expressions of wealth on a scale divorced from ordinary economic reality, and they're concentrated in the hands of monarchs, oligarchs, and a tiny number of tech billionaires. Dilbar isn't an aberration. She's typical of the upper end of superyacht culture, where the wealthy compete through increasingly large and expensive vessels. The shipyard workers who lost their jobs when Dilbar was frozen probably did not weep for Usmanov's plight. They lost income and employment because of geopolitics and decisions made by billionaires and heads of state. The crew members who were terminated overnight lost their livelihoods. Some of them had likely spent years working their way up in the superyacht industry, building specialized skills and experience, and they suddenly found themselves unemployed because their employer happened to be a sanctioned Russian oligarch. The ripple effects of sanctions go far beyond the billionaires they target. They impact workers, suppliers, contractors, and entire communities that have built economies around servicing the ultra-wealthy. Hamburg's maritime industry suffered because Dilbar sat idle for years. The yacht was supposed to be a customer, generating fees and employment. Instead, she became a burden and a symbol of political dysfunction. And then there's the question of what happens next, assuming Dilbar really has escaped German waters. If the yacht is now controlled by an independent trustee, as Usmanov's representatives claim, where does she go? Does she sail to Turkey or the UAE, where other Russian yachts have found refuge? Does she head to the Maldives or Seychelles? Can she enter European ports, or will authorities seize her again the moment she docks somewhere in the EU? The legal battles are far from over. Multiple investigations and court cases remain active. The Hamburg court ruling prohibiting media from saying Usmanov owns Dilbar doesn't change the fact that EU sanctions lists still include him and his sister. The yacht's legal status exists in a murky zone between different jurisdictions and interpretations of trust law. What's clear is that Dilbar has become far more than just a yacht. She's a symbol of how the global elite structure their wealth to avoid oversight, how sanctions can be both powerful and limited, and how even wars that displace millions of people ultimately come down to questions of money, power, and who controls what. Usmanov himself remains an enigmatic figure. He's been described by the EU as one of Putin's favorite oligarchs, but he's also been a major philanthropist, donating billions to cultural, educational, and sports initiatives. He served as president of the International Fencing Federation and was re-elected to that position even after being sanctioned. He bought James Watson his Nobel Prize medal for $4.8 million and then returned it to Watson with funds designated for cancer research, saying a situation in which an outstanding scientist sells a medal recognizing his achievements is unacceptable. He owns the Kommersant publishing house, but has also been accused of using it to suppress criticism of Putin. He made early investments in Facebook and other tech companies that generated enormous returns, showing business acumen that transcends his origins in post-Soviet metals and mining. He's been married to Irina Viner, a rhythmic gymnastics coach close to Putin since 1992, though they filed for divorce in May of 2022, possibly in an attempt to shield assets from sanctions. The story Usmanov tells about himself is one of a man who was falsely imprisoned, who built wealth through intelligence and hard work, and who has been unfairly targeted by Western governments because of his nationality and perceived connections, rather than any actual wrongdoing. His critics tell a different story, a man who served prison time for real crimes, who enriched himself through connections to corrupt officials during the lawless privatization era, and who has remained close to Putin throughout decades of increasingly authoritarian rule. The truth probably lies somewhere between these narratives, but the ultimate truth doesn't change the fact that Dilbar, a yacht named for his beloved mother, spent 3 years trapped in a German shipyard, unable to move, while lawyers fought over ownership documents and courts tried to untangle corporate structures specifically designed to be untangleable. The other Russian yachts that were seized or detained tell similar stories. The Amadea, a 348-foot yacht linked to oligarch Suleiman Karimov, was seized in Fiji in May of 2022 and transferred to San Diego, where the U.S. government now spends $10 million per year just to keep her maintained while legal battles drag on. The Phi, once owned by a Russian businessman, sat detained on the River Thames in London for over 2 years. The sailing yacht A, a 468-foot sailing yacht with futuristic design owned by coal billionaire Andrei Melnichenko, remains arrested in Trieste, Italy, unable to leave port. Some of these vessels will eventually be sold at steep discounts, like the Alfa Nero, which went for $40 million after being valued at $120 million. Others will likely sit for years, while ownership disputes wind through courts. A few, like Dilbar apparently has, will find ways through legal maneuvering to escape the sanctions net. But all of them represent wealth on a scale so enormous that the vessels themselves become geopolitical assets, tools of pressure, symbols of excess, and bargaining chips in conflicts that have nothing to do with maritime recreation. Consider the math of what Dilbar represents. The initial construction cost of $600 million to $800 million is just the beginning. Add 3 years of sanctions-related legal fees, which, for a case this complex and high stakes, probably ran into tens of millions of dollars. Add the lost opportunity cost of having a major asset completely frozen and unable to generate any value or utility. Add the damaged reputation from being the world's most famous trapped yacht, featured in headlines across the globe as a symbol of sanctioned Russian wealth. Add the terminated crew, the halted maintenance, the risk of physical deterioration from years of immobility. The total cost to Usmanov of having Dilbar trapped in Hamburg likely exceeded $1 billion when you account for all direct and indirect expenses. For context, that's more than the GDP of several small nations. It's more than the entire annual budget of many universities or hospitals. And it all stems from decisions made by a handful of politicians in response to a war that Usmanov claims he had no role in starting or supporting. The yacht was supposed to be his sanctuary, his escape, his monument to success. She was meant to cruise the Mediterranean in summer, host parties for his wealthy friends and business associates, provide a mobile home away from the politics and pressures of Moscow. The 25-meter pool was supposed to see swimmers. The garden was supposed to flourish with its specially developed salt-tolerant grass. The 2 helipads were supposed to receive his helicopter bringing guests from nearby airports. The 80 crew members were supposed to keep everything running smoothly, maintaining the engines, preparing meals, attending to every need of Usmanov and his guests. Instead, Dilbar became a prison of a different sort, not for her owner, but for herself. She sat immobile in Hamburg while the world moved on, while other yachts cruised past, while the war in Ukraine ground through its second and then third year with no end in sight. The irony is that Usmanov had tried to protect himself through the exact kind of complex offshore structure that wealthy people use to shield assets from taxes and legal exposure. The Cayman Islands registration, the Cyprus holding company, the Swiss trust, the named beneficiary being his sister rather than himself, all of it was designed to create distance between Usmanov and the asset. In normal circumstances, this structure would have worked perfectly. Tax authorities would have had difficulty establishing ownership. Creditors would have struggled to pierce the corporate veil. Even divorce proceedings would have been complicated by the layers of legal entities. But sanctions are different from normal legal proceedings. Sanctions don't require the same burden of proof. They are based on determinations by government officials that certain individuals pose risks to national security or foreign policy interests. Once someone is sanctioned, authorities can go after assets, even if ownership is murky or indirect. The EU explicitly stated they believed Usmanov had transferred assets to family members to evade sanctions, and they sanctioned those family members too. The offshore structure that was supposed to protect Dilbar ended up being irrelevant. What Usmanov learned, along with other sanctioned Russian oligarchs, is that there are limits to how much wealth can be shielded when entire governments mobilize to freeze it. The task force Kleptocapture, established by the U.S. Department of Justice specifically to enforce sanctions against Russian oligarchs, represented a level of coordination and determination that went beyond normal law enforcement. The task force included agents from the FBI, the IRS, the DEA, the U.S. Marshal Service, and other agencies, all working together to track down hidden assets. Similar efforts were launched by the EU and UK. For the first time in modern history, Western governments were treating oligarch wealth as a national security issue and dedicating serious resources to finding and freezing it. Private companies that specialized in offshore services suddenly found themselves under intense scrutiny. Yacht brokers, ship management companies, and maritime registries faced pressure to disclose ownership information they'd previously kept confidential. The entire ecosystem that services the ultra-wealthy came under stress as governments made clear they were willing to pursue assets through multiple jurisdictions and weren't going to be deterred by corporate structures or legal technicalities. Dilbar's story is still being written. As of late 2025, her exact legal status remains unclear. The footage of her in the North Sea suggests she's escaped Hamburg, but where she's going and under what legal authority remains to be seen. Will she end up in Turkey, where Usmanov could potentially visit her without risking arrest? Will she sail to the Maldives or Seychelles, joining other Russian mega-yachts in island sanctuaries beyond Western reach? Will German authorities try to intercept her before she leaves European waters? Will other EU nations attempt to seize her if she enters their ports? These questions don't have answers yet, and the legal battles could continue for years. What's certain is that Dilbar will never again represent what she once did for Usmanov, a pure expression of success, free from complications or controversy. She's now forever associated with sanctions, with Putin's war in Ukraine, with the complex legal battles over her ownership, and with the broader story of how Russian oligarch wealth became a target of Western governments. The yacht cost somewhere between $600 million and $800 million to build, required $50 to $80 million annually to operate. held records for interior volume and pool size, featured a real garden and 2 helipads, and enough electrical cabling to stretch from one end of Germany to the other. She represented the pinnacle of private luxury, built by one of Europe's most prestigious shipyards for a billionaire, who had risen from a Soviet prison to become one of the richest men in Russia. And then she sat motionless in Hamburg for 3 years, trapped by sanctions, fought over by lawyers, unable to fulfill the purpose she was built for. If Dilbar has indeed escaped, it's because Usmanov's legal team found a way through the maze of regulations and court rulings, convinced authorities that the ownership structure meant the yacht wasn't truly a sanctioned asset, and secured permission for her to leave German waters. It's a testament to the power of expensive lawyers and complex offshore structures, but it's also a reminder that even billion-dollar yachts are ultimately vulnerable to geopolitics. Back on that morning of March 3rd, 2022, when workers arrived at Blohm plus Voss to find Dilbar sealed off, surrounded by security, crew members receiving termination notices, nobody could have predicted exactly how this story would unfold. Nobody knew the yacht would sit there for 3 years. Nobody knew German prosecutors would launch and then drop investigations. Nobody knew courts would rule that media couldn't say Usmanov owned the yacht. Nobody knew that in 2025, video footage would show Dilbar moving through the North Sea under her own power, apparently freed from the sanctions that had held her. What everyone did know was that the world had fundamentally changed on February 24th when Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine, and that change would reshape everything, including the fate of a 512-foot yacht named after a Russian billionaire's mother. The number of people whose lives were directly affected by Dilbar's immobilization is small. Usmanov himself, his family members, the crew who lost their jobs, the lawyers who made millions arguing over ownership, the German officials who had to manage the situation. But the symbolic importance of the yacht goes far beyond those individuals. Dilbar became a physical representation of the sanctions regime, a concrete demonstration that Western governments could reach Russian oligarch assets even when those assets were hidden behind layers of offshore entities. She became a news story that people around the world followed, a symbol of wealth so extreme it seemed almost obscene while millions of Ukrainians fled their homes and cities were reduced to rubble. The yacht's value, $750 million, could have rebuilt entire neighborhoods destroyed in the war. The annual operating costs could have fed thousands of refugee families for years. This contrast wasn't lost on anyone, and it made Dilbar a target not just of sanctions, but of a broader cultural reckoning with inequality and oligarch power. Now, as Dilbar potentially sails away from Hamburg toward whatever destination her controllers have chosen, the yacht leaves behind questions that won't be easily answered. Did the sanctions work? Usmanov lost access to his yacht for 3 years and spent enormous sums fighting legal battles. But if the yacht ultimately escapes, did the sanctions achieve their purpose? Do structures like the Sisters' Trust actually protect assets from government action? Or do they just delay the inevitable? How much did Usmanov's legal victory, if it is indeed a victory, cost him in money and reputation? What precedent does this set for other sanctioned individuals in their attempts to shield assets? Will other oligarchs now feel emboldened to use similar trust structures, or will governments close these loopholes? The answers will emerge over time as more cases work through courts and as the sanctions regime evolves in response to what it learns from cases like Dilbar. What remains is the yacht herself, 156 meters of steel and luxury, 15,917 tons of engineering excellence, 3,800 square meters of living space, a 25-meter pool, a garden with salt-tolerant grass, 2 helipads, 30,000 kilowatts of diesel-electric hybrid power, 1,100 kilometers of electrical cabling, accommodations for 24 guests and 96 crew, all of it built to satisfy one man's vision of the ultimate superyacht. She was named Dilbar, which means beloved in Persian, after the mother of a man who served prison time in the 1980s for crimes he claims were fabricated, who built a fortune in the chaos of Soviet collapse, who invested in Facebook before most people understood what social media would become, who grew close enough to Vladimir Putin to be called one of his favorite oligarchs, and who watched his crown jewel asset become trapped in a German shipyard because of a war he says he had nothing to do with. The yacht that was supposed to represent ultimate freedom became the world's most expensive prisoner, and whether she's now truly free or simply moving from one form of captivity to another remains to be seen.